I'm giving everyone a warm welcome to the event and workshop with Anna Pagani around mapping the pressures on the social housing system. This is going to be a workshop as well as a case study, and it's hosted by the SI London Hub as well as the SI Cities Hub. And firstly, it's a great pleasure to introduce Anna Pagani, and she's an Italian architect who's been doing a lot of research in this field, and I'm going to give it on to Anna.
Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure. Thank you so much for hosting this workshop and for inviting me to present part of our research, but also to give the possibility to discuss with people outside the academic environment, which is always extremely enriching about what we're doing. So as introduced, I'm a researcher. I'm actually a research fellow at UCL, at IDE, the Institute of Environmental Design and Engineering. I work with Mike Davis and Nikki Zimmerman on a project that is funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. And I've been working on housing for quite some years now, and in particular on housing and systems thinking. So it's trying to build bridges between these two words. But before telling you more about the project or about exactly what it entails, I would like to know a little bit about who is in the room. And that is why I would invite you to click on the Miro board link that it's in the meeting chat, and to go to this box, to this part, and to write who you are. But in terms of, it doesn't need to be your profession. It can be if you're a tenant, if you're or a housing curious, a systems thinker, or an architect, like the way in which you wish to define yourself. It's just for me to understand who I have in front of me. So without any particular way of doing that. Nice, I can see already some interesting things popping up, like urban foresight researcher. We have someone in public health foresight researcher. Also, the research that I'm doing is looking at housing and health. So very interesting. Homeless service consultant. Of course, the topic of social housing is tightly linked with homelessness. Computational designer and innovation consultant. Yes, innovation, very interesting as well. A person who was once homeless and slept under a bridge, so now appreciate having a bed and roof. I fully understand also that part of my interviewees also are sharing these experiences. Very, very important to have this input. So thanks for joining. And also affordable housing, health facilities developer and systems thinking. Fantastic. Excellent. It's very interesting. Great. I would just give you maybe one more minute. Oh, I think that somebody's moving the board around. Don't worry. It can happen. It can be messy. I will just give you one more minute and then I will start the presentation. But it's good to see that there is this diversity. And in any case, no matter the job that we do, no matter what we're looking at, housing is still a concern for all of us. So it is quite it is a basic need, a universal need. And so no matter if we are professionals in, for instance, computational designers, or if we are lifelong learner and students for life, housing is still going to be a very important part of our life, if not a pillar. So thank you all for sharing who you are. And if that's okay for you, I can now start the presentation. And then we can always come back to this afterwards if some things had been added. So a little bit of context. So first of all, I want to ask you all to always feel free to interrupt me or to ask questions along the way. Very important. I typically don't like to give presentations alone. I like when I'm interrupted or when things are unclear. It means that actually it's even better when things are unclear because we can clarify them for everyone. Secondly, I want to point to the fact that social housing is a place where a lot of different views and different stakeholders are involved, which means that what I'm going to show you now is not the truth. Sometimes we think that researchers or scientists are searching for the truth, the answer, in what we call a more positivist view, like a mathematical view, that there's going to be a final result to this equation, but we're actually just constructing a reality. So what we're trying to do is to put together the views of very different people and very different stakeholders who need common understanding, need to understand each other, and they do not manage to. And so what I'm going to show you today is basically a view of the problem that already in the course of the research and on the day of today has already been in 2 interviews that I've done questions, put into question, changed, has evolved. So it is not a static final result. So on this premise, first of all, the question is, what is social housing itself? Because the notion of social housing is already a problem. Like defining what social housing is already something that differs depending on the people that we're talking to. So officially, if we look at the National Housing Federation, we can read that social housing is more affordable than housing on the open market. It can be rented in the UK from housing associations or councils. That's why it can be also called council housing, and it happens at reduced rents. Sometimes it can be part sold, part rented as shared ownership, and it mainly exists to help people who can't afford to rent or buy a home on the open market. Social rented housing typically delivers rents that are 50% of market rates. So hopefully you, in any case, manage to catch what social housing is. And so social rented housing typically delivers rent that are 50% of market rates. And they also go together with long-term security of tenure. So sometimes you will hear affordable housing, social housing. Well, social rents are really different, let's say, from affordable housing. So a little bit of context, there was a breakthrough in 1919 after the First World War, and the councils were responsible for delivering or meeting housing needs. So there was massive building of housing in the 50s also after the Second World War. The rate of construction was very high. We talk about nearly 150,000 homes a year. And imagine that a quarter of all countries' housing was council housing in the 1960s. So most of the urban fabric that you see around you is social housing, or again, it's called council housing in the UK because it's built by the councils. But then significant public funding went to housing associations, which are non-profit associations, to build new homes. And these housing associations also grew a lot. There were 400,000 housing associations homes in England by the 1980s. And then what happens is that towards the 90s, so still in the 80s, The council, well, the housing stock started being older and older, difficult to maintain, and there were certain policies in the government that allowed to transfer the ownership of the housing stock to housing associations. So the councils were giving away their housing stock, and the right to buy in the 80s allowed in particular tenants to buy their own homes. What this means in a graph, if we look here, council homes used to be about 31% of the total stock, and it got down to 17%. So there was a drastic reduction in the social housing stock in England. And also the amount of homes that were built has been drastically going down. So a very strong reduction related to funds, related to policies, so many choices that led to this decrease. So I'm going to again ask you, and we're going to again go back to the mirror. What are, in your opinion, or in what you experience, the key issues related to social housing? So if you go back to the mirror again, I hope that you see my screen in the mirror. Here there is a second part, that is a pink part, where you can just write down some keywords of what you think are the key issues related to social housing according to you. Agreed. Yeah. So if I can start reading, I read systemic racism. It's one point that we're also gonna try to address today. I read lack of collaborative initiatives, the idea of ownership, which is the one that was actually fueling the right to buy, supply from New Zealand, if I'm correct. So the fact that there is not enough social housing. In general, the privatization of social goods, that went through housing, health, and so many other. Privatization, I can see, goes actually together. Myth that bigger is better, that the more, true. Productivity of construction sector, creating and maintaining housing supply. Yeah, maintenance and repair. It's quite a challenge, and for the construction sector in general, one of the challenges it faces. Significant capital needs, repair, and not enough funds. True. Financial viability, yes. Funding scarcity are one of the key issues in social housing, most probably all around the world. Not enough space and a growing demand. We know that the demand for housing, like we talk a lot about the need for housing in London, that is actually growing a lot. Neoliberal policies goes together with privatization, NIMBYism in planning. So land, and excellent. I think we have already quite a good overview. So thank you very much for sharing these ideas. And I think we're gonna touch upon most of the things that you mentioned. So, but we're also gonna have some time to discuss this. So back to the slides. if we look at the UK specifically, we can see that the housing, the fact that, let's say, the supply of housing, of social housing, has reduced so much from 31% to 17%, meant that only the tenants with the highest needs were accessing social housing. In fact, you can see that the people who were living, like the richest and the poorest, who were living in social housing, was pretty much distributed, but over time, it's just accommodated the lowest income quintile. On the top of that, we can see that social housing, that a large majority of ethnic minorities and people of color live in social housing due to complex structures that bring to deprivation and socioeconomic disadvantages. We can also see that one of the challenges of social housing is overcrowding. Overcrowding that can also be led to different family structures, but not only, which are incompatible with the sizes of the dwellings that are there, and an old housing stock. So if you look at the light blue line, we can see that for social renters, there is a stronger percentage of overcrowding. So it comes as nearly no surprise that there was a disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Bain communities, which was one of the starting point of this research. The Levelling Up Housing and Communities Committee says the condition of some homes in England has deteriorated so far as to be unfit for human habitation. The government funding specifically for regeneration, however, is at present lacking, and this gives way to business and property-led redevelopment because there is no economic support to build and regenerate social housing. And the focus on regeneration and new build has diverted attention from the need or possibility, I would actually say, to maintain and repair. So sometimes sites that were marked for regeneration has fallen into disrepair. And on the top of these challenges, you also have climate change and the need to try to fight fuel poverty, which means building more efficient or refurbishing dwellings so that they can be more efficient. And social rented homes are doing quite well. They have reduced, this is if you look at it from right to left, they have reduced quite significantly the amount of buildings that were in band D and G. However, it's one additional challenge for their fundings. So we can see that the social housing sector plays a central role in meeting the needs of what is a growing urban population. You were showing in the issues when you were mapping a population that is actually growing within the planetary boundaries. So in order not to exceed the limits that we have in this planet. However, it is threatened by several goals: political, economic, environmental, and social pressures. So how can we navigate these challenges? That's the question. And that's why we're here today. So in this sector, we could imagine that these different pressures are looking at the problem from very different angles. So instead of seeing the social housing sector as an elephant on its own with all of the problems, we look at different angles of it, like this is a spare, this is a fan, this is a wall, this is a snake, and this is exactly, this is the economic issue, or this is what residents think, this is what developers think, and this is what housing associations or council think. And in order to, how to think about this holistically, well, we could go back actually to ancient Greece, but if we think of 1972, there have been people thinking about this way before us. So in 1972, a group of people gathered in Rome to discuss whether our limits to growth were compatible with the limits of our planet. And at the time, the group of Forrester at MIT used what is called system dynamics to try to model the interrelationship between so many factors that were shaping our world in what they called the word model 3. So the word model was putting together and was mapping, let's say, the interrelationship between, for instance, food and lifetime and land use and mortality. So showing the interrelation between all of these, and was using this model to try to imagine or simulate possible futures and their consequences on a very smaller scale. So I don't want to say that we are as ambitious as the Limits to Growth and as the Group of Forester, but we are applying a similar approach to the problems affecting the delivery and regeneration of social housing. What did we do? We took the Better Social Housing Review, which is a review that was published in December of last year, of 2022. So very updated review of the key issues in the social housing sector. And we extracted variables from it. So we transformed sentences into concepts. But since the Better Social Housing Review was not addressed everything, let's say, and in particular was not addressing gentrification, we also added a book chapter, which is the gentrification of social housing, and to complement the first maps. How did we build exactly those maps and what are they? So I give you an example. On the left, you see what is called the data example. So a sentence from the Better Social Housing Review. For instance, imposed requirements on housing associations' expenditure have increased considerably and operating margins have decreased. This we call it financial pressure on housing association. So this is the way in which we translate the sentence into a concept. Then this following sentence is that the focus on proactive economic regulation in pursuit of financial viability has led some housing associations to become far more commercial in their focus. So we can see here in the right how we map that a financial pressure has increased the commercial focus. But we need to imagine this arrow also as a let's say as also the other way around, in the sense that if the financial pressure was to decrease, also the commercial focus will be decreasing. So they go in the same direction. The more the financial pressure, the more the commercial focus, the less the financial pressure, the less the commercial focus. So plus means basically goes in the same direction. If we continue, stakeholders told us that too many 1 or 2 bed units are being built to hit development targets, and that there is consequently even more pressure on the availability of larger properties for intergenerational family groups, which means that the more the commercial focus, the smaller the size of new dwellings. So actually here we are again seeing an interrelationship that in this case is negative. So they go in opposite directions. And this can lead to overcrowding, which can in turn have negative health impact for tenants. So the size of new dwellings can lead to overcrowding, affecting health. So the more the overcrowding, the less tenants' health. This is in a nutshell how we map causal interrelationships. So today we're just going to call them maps, but if you want to know the technical terms for the ones who are not familiar with it, they're called causal loop diagrams. So by doing this exercise, we derived 6 main themes. The first shows the external pressures on the housing supply, dynamics of exclusion, management challenges. I'm going to guide you through this. But just to say that the first 4 are from the Better Social Housing Review and the last 2 are on the gentrification of social housing. This is more or less what the maps look like. Today, we're going to look only at 4 of those so that we can have more time and discuss it in smaller groups. But there is one important point to say, which is that I'm going to show you today these 4 maps. But what those maps are, it's a tool for, dialoguing, conversation between people and among people, and it's a way of also disconfirming and reconfirming what it's written in there. So we have done, and we are keeping doing, workshops and interviews in order to validate or disconfirm these links and transform, let's say, this review into something that is a kind of a tool for dialogue. So this is an example of a picture that I took after a workshop with housing associations on the first map. So I'm now going to guide you through the first map and to actually the 4 maps. And please, again, feel free to interrupt me if something is unclear. And so I'm going to try to guide you step by step. So for the people for whom it's the first time that you look at a systems map, hopefully it's going to be easier for you. So the red links show, again, what I showed you before, the plus. So the two variables go in the same direction. When there is a blue link, it's a minus, so meaning that they go in opposite directions. An important thing that you see in this graph are also the R and the Bs. The R is a reinforcing loop. It means that when I read this dynamic is reinforcing, for instance, the financial pressure on housing association. So the financial pressure has certain consequences that eventually reinforce this pressure. And it's that balancing loop, the Bs, do the opposite thing. So like the commercial focus leads to a certain construction, which travels through the system and eventually would balance or reduce this commercial focus. Another bizarre thing that you may, yes, Anya, you have a question.
I have a quick interrupting question.
Yeah.
So when you look at this map, where's the first area you look into, or does it really depend? Is there do you look at the top right?
It's an excellent question. Like theoretically, you could start from anywhere in order to read it. You can take any element in the system. It's all elements are interconnected. I'm going to guide you in the way in which I've built it. So I'm going to start reading it from a specific variable, but you could start reading it from any point in the map. So thank you for the question. There is another question. What do you mean by external? Don't worry, I'm gonna clarify this in the point. Like, let's say that yes, they are. The one question was that basically whether the pressures that I'm gonna now guide you through are actually external or whether they are endogenous. Yes, this depends on, let's say, the boundaries that we set. So by the way in which I am mapping the system, I'm putting climate change in, which means that it's within the system's boundary, because it means that I am considering it. However, when we think about the social housing supply and the direct supply of housing, these can be considered as external pressures that are kind of affecting the supply of housing as an action. So as housing associations, etc., supplying housing. So that is the term. Let's say it's less of a systems term. I would say from a system boundaries perspective, indeed, those are, but as you can see, for instance, climate change is like an external factor affecting the system. So it is, we didn't map it within the system. We didn't integrate it in the system because there are several things that then would impact on climate change and so on and so forth. But just now to keep just explaining how the map works, you're also going to see this strange shape here. What this shape means, you should imagine it as like a bathtub. So you can imagine it like here, there is water coming in and the water goes up. And this is like construction comes in and you have more social housing. And then you have water that goes out and the water goes down. And this is like demolition. So this is called basically inflow and outflow. And this is a stock. So it's a stock and flow. So here you have an inflow, construction increases social housing and demolition decreases it. So this is about the reading and how you read these maps. But then now let me just guide you through the story so that I don't take too much time and I leave you sufficient time to then play a little bit around where to intervene in such systems. So the story that this part of the diagram wants to tell is that there are several, as they define them, also external pressures, if we want to use the words, of also the people who are in the system that are affecting the social housing supply. So there have been some political shifts that have been reducing funding available and increased the financial pressure on the housing associations, which have pushed for a stronger commercial focus. This stronger commercial focus, if we look at the red arrow, is something that is increasing construction. So since there is a financial pressure, the commercial focus entails the need to build more and more and more in order to be able to finance the building of social housing. So sometimes they need to build homes that can be sold in order to then be able to finance the social homes. So there is a focus on building, and this focus on building eventually should kind of balance out the social housing shortage. At the same time, however, this commercial focus, as I've already guided you through before, has been leading to smaller housing units, which can lead to overcrowding and affect tenants' health. Again, some of these relationships I'm presenting today, I've been discussing them in interviews, etc. There is a lot hidden behind those variables, but please take it just as an exercise today. So the size of new dwellings, at the same time, if they're smaller, it creates a social housing shortage. And the shortage we have seen before in the data, the less we have housing, the more the people who live in social housing are the ones that have the highest needs. And these needs can be complex. They can really span from really merely economic needs to actually needs that require the adaptation of housing to disability and other issues. So housing associations also need to comply with more complex standards, also due to climate change, which is imposing more requirements, which are putting more financial pressure on housing association. And at the same time, the social housing shortage I've introduced you before when I was showing you kind of an overview of the social housing sector, showing you how some policies that having been encouraging property have decreased the supply or have led to a social housing shortage. So this is just the first map that shows the challenges that I've introduced you at the beginning, and also some of the ones that you have written down in the post-its. Again, always feel free to interrupt me. The second map that we're going to look at today is dynamics of exclusion. So some of you discussed about systemic racism in the post-its. So this map shows many reinforcing loops. We can see on the left two of the variables that were there before, the share of tenants with complex need and overcrowding. These are actually strengthening some assumptions that we have over tenants and in social housing tenants, which reinforce this stigma and discrimination that happens in the social housing sector. Stigma and discrimination brings to have certain assumption on tenants and on their problems by the staff. Sometimes there are assumptions that can be built, which brings to the exclusion of, in particular, ethnic minorities from decision-making, some from making decisions about an estate, for instance. And this exclusion reinforces stigma and discrimination. Here we have something new that you might ask, what does it mean? The dotted lines. Dotted lines are hypotheses that we built. So it was not in the Better Social Housing Review. We built this hypothesis. Then this exclusion from decision-making reinforces certain barriers. They can be bureaucratic, they can be personal, like language barriers, or time and cost indeed to report issues and to get engaged in decision-making. Not everyone has the same ability and same time to report issues on their housing and to get involved in decisions regarding where they live. So this is a dynamic that reinforces exclusion. At the same time, these assumptions create more disconnection with the issues that tenants have. So if I assume that there is a problem, I'm less connected to what that problem really is. And at the same time, this connection with that problem creates more assumptions. So again, a reinforcing dynamic. This disconnection also decreases the evidence-based decision-making that staff can have, because it's more difficult to make decisions and have proper insights if there is a disconnection between the people who make a decision and the tenants. And this affects the quality of the housing stock and the health of tenants, eventually reinforcing the stigma and discrimination. At the same time, this connection brings about, it makes it more difficult, let's say, to have representation of BAME in management and in housing associations, because it's more difficult for people, again, to engage in decision-making. Just raised your hands, so feel free to interrupt me.
Yeah, I'm just noting there's a lot of reinforcing positive feedback loops in this one, isn't there? Is there anything you can say about the overall dynamics of this scenario due to that?
Yes, yes. So since there are many reinforcing loops, also because we're trying to map issues. And in this case, there are problems that are actually reinforcing themselves. Often, if you talk also and if you interview people who are also working on possible solutions or a way to counter these dynamics, you have many more balancing loops. So this is one of the limitations also of these maps. Since we're looking at issues tend to reinforce each other instead of balancing them out. Typically, if they balance themselves out, and if we are not, for instance, otherwise, if I were showing like a problem in a balancing loop, then we would see how this problem actually gets better. Or if I was showing a solution in a balancing loop, I would actually show a problem that is actually preventing the solution to really happen. In this case, it's mainly problems that are reinforcing themselves. So it's more like a bias of how we are mapping the problem in this case. Is that clear?
Yeah, you could say the framing or the perspective. Yeah.
Yeah. And so in this, thank you for the question. I think it's important to mention. And so this connection affects the representation, both in management, so in the upper parts of the management, and in the tenants and the housing associations. This has also been done. It's due also to the fact that in order to have more viability and be this commercial focus has also pushed housing associations to merge and to become bigger. So it's more difficult to have diversity. Let's say certain smaller housing associations have been incorporated. Again, I don't want to generalize because it's not the case for all housing associations, but the maps pushes us, again, another bias, to generalize a little bit. This has led to what we call a social infrastructure deficit. So it gets more difficult, again, for people to engage in decisions, for people to interact with each other, to be more cohesive between themselves and with housing associations, and this has an impact on health eventually. So that's what we call dynamics of exclusion. I just am careful about the time, so just 5 more minutes. This map was also derived from the Better Social Housing Review and shows what we call an archetype, a systems archetype. What is a systems archetype is something that you can find many examples of in the world. So basically, it's a structure that you can see very often in many different situations. And in this case, it helped us. It's called shifting the burden. What we can see, and it's the one that you see in thicker lines. So I'm going to guide you through that. So basically, more construction, it seems to be, since we were talking about it with Joss, a kind of a solution to the social housing shortage. So to balance the social housing shortage is perceived as a solution. But what it does is that it deviates funding for maintenance and repair, which is actually decreasing maintenance and repair, which will be the more fundamental solution. Again, there could be a lot of debate about this because we could also argue the fact that construction is actually helping funding maintenance and repair by building new buildings. However, this is the way in which we depicted it from the report. So again, it can be discussed and debated. And so at the same time, the social housing shortage is worsened by the fact that there is a difficulty to know how many houses are actually empty. So there are problems with empty property accounts. And because we also have poor quality of the data on the social housing stock. Another very important variable is that there is a VAT on retrofitting, which encourages construction and demolition instead of retrofit. So the VAT, of course, disadvantages retrofit, which would help to improve the quality of the housing stock and help improve tenant satisfaction. This last bit here is like a hypothesis that we had, because we know that also lawyers' intervention play an important role in the scarcity of funding for housing associations. And actually, often they need to intervene when there are tensions, when things are happening that do not work quite well. So if tenants were to be more satisfied or happy with the conditions of housing, also that cost would hopefully reduce. The last map is basically another map that shows another archetype. So you can see again in bold, I mean, in thicker lines. This is called fixes that fail. Again, we see a balancing loop, which is a fix. So we're trying to solve a problem. What is the problem here is segregation and poverty concentration. And what is the solution is a production of social mixing as a potential solution to this more problem of segregation and poverty concentration. And what we see on the right, all these loops that we see happening, is what we call unintended consequences of this fix. So social mixing is when we really try to mix different populations. In the case of the book chapter, it was talking about mixing people with different socioeconomic backgrounds. What happens, what the book chapter describes, is that this leads to the expulsion, displacement, and dispossession of residents. And so increases actually segregation and poverty concentration. Because in parallel, it also, increases the number of higher socioeconomic status residents in neighborhoods that were predominantly inhabited by low socioeconomic status residents, which over time brings about a domination, let's say, of a certain culture and aesthetics over another, which increases, again, segregation even within an estate, and brings to an emotional displacement because the culture changes within your estate, and a physical one because people leave and are substituted by other people. And this leads to forms of tensions, divisions, sense of surveillance, so within a community, and also increases the share of tenants with complex needs because there is less housing available for those tenants. And so again, the people who can access to social housing are more and more a smaller category of people, which increases stigma and discrimination and leads to the reinforcing dynamics that we already saw. At the, let's say, origin of these, there are these policies that have been encouraging property and privatization. So that have been, let's say, depicting social housing as a problem and that have actually reduced funding for it, a desire to attract capital, and of course, beliefs and mental models that social mixing would be a remedy for residualization. Again, I'm showing you a map that has been largely discussed, whether or not social mixing is a good thing or is not a good thing. I want you all to be aware that it's the topic of a very large debate. And for now, there is not one unique answer. So this map is showing something that is depicted in a book chapter, but it's not showing one unique truth. So if you're going to talk to different people, you're going to hear very different things. And I want to always point you to this. So now, it's your turn. I'm going to stop talking. Finally, you say. And we're going to finally look at how to intervene in such a system. So when we think about places to intervene in a system, Donella Meadows, who was one of the authors of The Limits to Growth and an incredible systems thinker who gave us a lot in the field, proposes 12 points where we could intervene in the system, from the least to the most important. I'm not asking you now to use specifically one of these points, but just to know that these points exist. So just to know what possible ways how can we, let's say, address what I've just shown you. It can start from something as basic as just to change numbers, like to change subsidies. Well, a problem is the financial issue. Let's change that number. Let's give more money. And actually already this will be a massive transformation in the social housing system. The more I talk to people in my interviews, the more I realize that it's definitely a big point. It can be a little bit more ambitious, trying to change the material stock and flows, the bathtub that I was showing you before, maybe switching, as we can see, here, instead of building more, to maintain and repair more, so demolishing less, changing the stock. And then we can also change, for instance, the rules of the system. We can give incentives, punishments, constraints. We can change the goal of the system. and ask, is really the goal of the system to give housing for all, or is it instead to make profit, or is it instead this one, and how can we readjust it? Or the most ambitious are the ones that have to do with the mindset and paradigm out of which the system arises. So structures, rules, delays, parameters, and more generally to transcend paradigms. But this is just something like to know that you can act on very different points of the system. So what we're going to do now, and we're on time, we're going to split ourselves into breakout rooms, and each breakout room is going to look at one map only. And that way you're going to have time to 5 minutes to introduce each other in the breakout room. And you're going to have 10 minutes to identify as many places as you can that could impact the model. So you're going to have post-its and be able to think we could intervene here or here, but you could also think to intervene in an intangible variable, like a change in mindset. And while you're going to intervene there, you will need to also think about feasibility and impact. So is the intervention that you are proposing feasible? Very much, like 5, or very little, like 1. So it would be amazing if this was happening, but not really feasible. And indeed, this amazing is impactful. So would it be impactful, like 5, or not impactful at all? 1. So maybe it can be that some of the things that you're going to propose are very feasible. You could do them right away, but do not have a very strong impact, or the other way around. And in the last 5 minutes, I would just ask you to rank these places to intervene, like PTI's places to intervene in the system. And you can decide how you wish to rank it. Maybe you want to put first the most impactful, or the most feasible, or the most relevant for you. There is no rule in the way in which you're going to rank it. And now we're going to gather back together, and we're going to have some minutes to summarize what has been discussed in the other breakout rooms. Good. So is there any question before we split into breakout rooms? I see some comments. Okay, it's more comment. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a nice chat. I know it was not easy in such a short amount of time. So I hope that this is just the beginning of a longer conversation. So these are the 4 maps, and I would just maybe ask one person per room, maybe if you wish, the moderator of each room, just to say in few words, just to tell the others what were your key takeaways, and so that others can learn from it. So maybe we can start with map 1. Yes, sorry, Joss, you wanted to say something.
I was just going to say that I have to go in a few minutes. Maybe I can start.
Okay, do you want, then we can start with yours.
Yeah, if you don't mind. We had a good conversation. Fortunately, we had Ian Dennis, wasn't it? Sorry, Nick and Dennis. Nick is well versed in this scenario, so brought in rich information to complement the map and inform me and Dennis, who aren't experts, on the situation. So we walked through it to better understand it. The one we got a little hung up on was the relationship between quality of data on housing stock and empty property amounts, but Nick kind of explained that to us a bit. There are essentially 2 intervention points here. On the top left was changing the VAT for retrofitting and putting that down to 0 to create the right incentives there, which Nick proposed. And then top right, maybe Nick, you want to talk about the top right, what you proposed there? You're on mute if you're talking.
Yeah, so funding scarcity is this whole kind of issue about creating sustainable housing or sustainable business model. And if you kind of work it out to maintain a property on the current basis, when they cost out on a build, it's flawed. It doesn't actually stack up, and that's what basically creates what the rent should be charged, and if you like, that funding model. And it's not really realistic. So yeah, that's one of the problems. Building more homes can reduce or contribute to reducing the issues, or provide funding through revenue, through rents, etc., but also increase on property sales or shared ownership.
Yes. Thank you for sharing. Excellent. So do you wish that we move to the next map then? So the map number 1 on the external pressures on the housing supply.
Yes, hi, it was me and Shahid. And we were also trying to understand and make sense of the whole map and scenario, and trying to understand which leverage point is most impactful and feasible. And we started discussing about the political shifts, how that is related to the intangible nature of the leverage point, wherein it involves mindset shift. And that's one of the most difficult things to do. So although it is quite impactful, but it's not super feasible to do. Whereas funding is something which makes a lot of sense because it's easily available to get alternative fundings. And then we were also discussing about the tenant's health, whether that is one of the leverage points, if we can consider that as one of the leverage points, because it's sort of outside the loop. And I would like to ask you over here, because we were sort of trying to understand if, I thought that we could consider it as one, because that affects like overall system of the house, and it could potentially help the tenant to get out of this system of getting into social housing by getting better with the health, and then better with the finances, better opportunities. So what do you think is tenants' health like one of the leverage points that is impactful enough or feasible enough?
It's a good question. Actually, if we look at housing health, we can consider that if housing is not, of course, you could look at the system from health. If there is better health, they can get better job and they can get better housing. However, if you imagine that the system is bounded, so there is only a certain amount of housing available, there will always be tenants who end up in the bad housing. So if you do not improve housing, but you just leave the housing as it is, some tenants will get better and will leave, but others will go back to that stock because it's a limited stock. So that's
it's an interesting one. Yeah, thank you. And then we were talking about climate change, how that's again an external one, which is super important related to each of them. So I think the way that we would rank it would be climate change, funding, and political shifts being the most impactful in that order.
Thank you for sharing. Okay, here we are on the dynamics of exclusion. I see a lot of, of points. Do you want to share, Anya, or some of your colleagues, the people who are with you, or you directly?
Up to you, Jack. Do you want to? Otherwise, I'll start, and Jack, you can interrupt if you want. So first of all, making our way through the map, we wanted to, I guess, intervene in the time and cost report issues and think about access, giving tenants access to directly report or create a form to ask for requests to improve the services and improve on quality of life of tenants. So integrate that kind of data. And that was one. So we rated it as a feasible option with a 4, and then the impact would be 3, but depending on time and cost, it might increase or so that was the first idea as an intervention. And then the second intervention was around staff assumptions and stigma and discrimination tendencies, and we were discussing about humanizing the different groups in the system that are all, so humanizing between stakeholders and breaking the bias and create common understanding amongst people as people instead of boxing them into categories. So we came up with an intervention idea of creating spaces in terms of events, or creating a space, could be in any form, for people to get together, exchange information, different perspectives on a very human level. And that was the second intervention idea we came up with. And in terms of feasibility, getting people together is quite difficult, we assume, and so we rated that 4. No, sorry, that's a 2. It's a 2. And then the impact really depends on how the space has been facilitated. We criticize safe space because we always ask safe space for who to share what information. Since many topics are quite sensitive and vulnerable, that would be very difficult to navigate around, we assume. And in the end, it's all about group dynamics. So it depends on the way an event is designed. So we gave it a 3 in terms of impact.
Thank you very much for sharing this. Very, very interesting. Thank you. So I think that now it's my turn. So I was together with Gus and with Shirley. Do you want me to go? And okay, and you can complement in case. So we had the failure of social mixing strategies map, quite a difficult one. But we thanks to their expertise and experience, actually, that came from, if I'm correct, the Netherlands and the US. Correct me again if I'm wrong. We thought of, actually they proposed some very interesting actions. So for instance, this artificial production of social mixing should actually come from people and from what people want. So be a more bottom-up intervention. This it's feasible, it's a 3, so it can happen, but it would definitely have a big impact. Then regarding residence expulsion, displacement and dispossession, having anti-displacement regulations like in the US would be very feasible and very impactful. And then lastly, up here on the sale of housing to the private sector, it will be a matter of having taxes, legislations that would prevent the sale. And it's feasible, but there can be resistance. So as Gus was saying, that depends. And in terms of impact, again, that depends on how the sale of the private housing sector, how much it is compared to the whole share of social housing. So we would see it only by looking at numbers, how big the impact would be. Have I forgotten everything, or that was okay? Okay, so thank you. So thank you all for sharing this. I think it's just, again, a beginning of a conversation. And in those last few minutes, I just want to show you just 2 additional slides. So what happens next and what is happening now? So we have seen, for the ones who are new to systems thinking, at least, that sometimes what we see as these events, like we're reading a lot in the newspaper of this is happening in social housing, this disaster, or this event, or these mold and damp issues, etc. Below have patterns and trends that have been there over time and have underlying structures that are allowing these patterns and trends to happen. And at the bottom, there's mental models. And several of the interventions that you actually proposed were indeed to address those mental models, to transform them in order to actually redesign the underlying structures, anticipate patterns and trends, and better react to events. So in this project, what we're trying to do at UCL is to address the way in which regeneration projects can contribute to or hinder a just transition towards housing sustainability. So we look at both at the co-benefits and unintended consequences of regeneration for sustainability and health. And we can see in this graph what is, let's say, how we could imagine a transition. So we first try to get some systems knowledge. So what are the key challenges related to social housing provision and regeneration? And today you saw some of the ones that we mapped using Lich2, but we are exploring it now with interviews with several different experts, as I've mentioned several times, in workshop and in other events. Then we try to understand the target. So where do we want this system to go? What is the sustainable target? What is a good social housing system? So we collect hopes and fears, top priorities for each of the stakeholders that we interview. And they're very diverse stakeholders. And we try to make them, to create dialogue and to create transformation knowledge. Transformation happens by mapping. We map together with the stakeholders and they become aware of the system, of their mental models as well. So mapping becomes a transformative process. And once we will have all of these maps together, we will be able to work together with them on places, on doing a similar exercise to the one that we did today, and think of places to intervene in the system while creating shared understanding and a common knowledge. So hopefully we will help all the stakeholders to address systemic questions. And before saying goodbye, I just, if you go again back, first of all, well, a big thank you. And if you go back to the Miro board, there is just a last part here. If you have any thought to share or anything, or want to leave your email, or want to know more about the research, or just anything that crosses your mind, my post-it was a very thank you for joining, but feel free to share a thought. And thank you. And if you need the link, because maybe you lost it, I'm gonna, I think, yeah, oh, Anya already shared it.
I shared it.
Thank you.
And if you want
Thank
to
you.
ask questions, you may ask
Yes.
as well. And
yeah, you can also unmute if you wish. You don't need to be silent. Don't. Let's say the mirror is for the ones who don't feel like unmuting, but feel free to unmute yourself and to just.
I wanted to share that in the city of Seattle, there was a proposal that was actually approved by voters to create a social housing board in Seattle. And so I think it's really interesting to think about this because we don't have the history of social housing really in the United States. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really important to examine work like yours and, yes. and others. Because I feel like some of us might be thinking about it in a reductionist way, like, oh, let's bring something that has been done successfully and maybe not as successfully in other places and impose that structure on this local context, which is very specific, as all local places mm-hmm. are. So I think there could be some issues, unintended consequences.
No, thank you for sharing. I was just last week at the International Social Housing Festival, where many case studies from everywhere in the world were presented, and a lot of learning from each other. Like people were learning from very excellent cases like Vienna, or I mean, I just want to show you in the mirror here, when I showed you what are the key issues around social housing. Well, this is a picture of social housing in Vienna, and yes, they have a swimming pool, and yes, it's a very different understanding of what social housing is. So there were excellent examples from countries like Vienna, like Finland. There was also the participation of the Netherlands. There was and it was in Spain. And so we have a lot to learn from each other, from different countries, a lot of mistakes and successes that every country can learn from, even if the system is different. Yes, Nick, please jump in.
Yeah, I think whether this fits with, I think, is it Shirley who mentioned it before? Is it like in the States and outside of the UK is what we might consider social housing? You've got community land trusts, and on the continent, particularly in Germany, Netherlands, you've got cooperatives.
Yes.
And they, in the UK, they fit under what is known as community-led housing.
Mhm.
What is being changed, I think, to a different term, which is, I think, self-determined housing or group housing. So it could be from anything from self-build using sweat equity and things like that, through to bringing back empty properties back into use and again using sweat equity, or partnering with a existing housing association.
Yeah. Thanks for precising that. And also, at the Social Housing Festival, they were showing how since you cited Community Land Trust, they're setting up a network, an international network, also again to learn from each other and reconnect all the different community land trusts that are building up around the world, and yeah, to support each other. But thanks for clarifying this point. Yeah, the word and the definition is something that plays a big role. Like today, we've been talking about social housing, but it's often also difficult due to the definition, because often it falls within affordable housing, and affordable housing can be a rent that is very different from a social rent. And so several stakeholders can say that they're building affordable housing, which is far from being a social rent. So the confusion in terminology is also one of the issues within the system. Possible to share the presentation with us post-meeting? Absolutely, happy to. And I'm very happy that your understanding of CLD and its significance has improved. I'm really, really happy to know this. It's always good. And that you know more about causal maps. So thank you for sharing this and for sharing these comments. So fantastic. So Anya, should I leave the word to you now?
Yes, I guess this is also on time, so we're on time with closing the event. And as I said, it will be posted on social media. There will be a YouTube link, so you can revisit the event and reach out to us if you have any more questions. Anna, may they reach out to you? Or
yes, absolutely. Please contact me by LinkedIn, by email. I'm very happy to continue these conversations and to welcome you at UCL to go for a coffee or to have a call. So please reach out.
Thank you so much, Anna, for your amazing insights and presentation. And
Thank you.
all the best for the next steps.
Thank you for having me again. Thank you very much. Thank you to all for being here.
Thank you.